Hi, everyone. It's my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker, Nancy Abudu. Ms. Abudu has been the Florida ACLU's Director of Legal Operations for a little over 3 years. It's her responsibility, along with our state legal panel, to select the cases we litigate and to manage our staff attorneys and cooperating attorneys. I could take up most of her speaking time admiring her accomplishments, but let me avoid doing so by saying simply that they range from representing victims of domestic violence for the Legal Aid Society in New York City to serving as an international elections observer for the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. And when the Conservative Federalist Society was looking for someone to serve on a panel discussing the Shelby County v. Holder decision, striking down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, they chose Nancy to sit alongside some major hitters on the right. So she has her creds on the other side as well. But most relevant to our topic today, she was a staff attorney for the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals. And that's the court to which Florida federal cases go for appeal. And thus, she's had an inside view of what judicial vacancies mean. And that's what we're anxious to hear about. So please join me in welcoming Nancy Abudu.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you to the League so much for having me here today. My co-speaker, Anisha Singh, is going to give you more of the nuts and bolts, facts and figures in terms of how many judicial vacancies we're facing and, a broader picture in terms of what the state of the courts look like. And so what I wanted to do for a few minutes today is talk more about the impact of judicial vacancies and what it means to have access to the courts, or as some people like to say, access to justice. And so in preparing for my talk today, I realized that sometimes people have different definitions of what it means to have access to justice. And so I'm going to borrow the definition from the U.S. Institute of Peace. And they state that access to justice means the ability of people to seek and obtain remedy through formal or informal institutions of justice in compliance with human rights standards. And I believe the Institute used the phrase human rights because often when we talk about access to justice, we're thinking about someplace outside of the United States. We're thinking of Rwanda, where you had a horrific genocide occur, and the importance of setting up criminal tribunals to make sure that victims had an opportunity to share their stories and be properly compensated, and that those who committed those crimes could be properly prosecuted and perhaps rehabilitated if that were indeed a possibility for them. And then, of course, we know of other atrocities that have happened around the world and how the establishment of international courts has again made sure that people have some remedy for their grievances. But we have an issue in terms of access to justice here in the United States. And there are many factors that weigh into why that issue is so important. One of them, of course, is the affordability of the justice system in the first place. One of the issues that the ACLU has tackled with is how do we incorporate the concept of economic justice into the work that we do as civil libertarians, as civil rights activists. And so what we've started to focus more on is the intersection between class and the courts, and what it means when someone can't afford to pay for proper legal representation as they navigate this system. So for someone who is of low income or no income, oftentimes people think that, well, maybe that means that you can't buy the house that you would like, or the car you would like to drive, or even educate your kids in the schools that will give you more confidence that they'll get a quality education. But when you talk about the intersection between class and the courts, you're raising the stakes even more. You're talking about someone facing criminal prosecution and a long sentence in a criminal prison penal institution simply because they cannot afford adequate legal counsel, and oftentimes because we have a system where we don't have enough judges who are able to go through and provide the guarantee of a speedy trial, and because we have public defender offices that are underfunded and understaffed and under-resourced in so many ways, and in some instances we have to acknowledge, made compromises in the context of their client's situation, which years later, when we review those records, might not have been the best or the wisest counsel. So you're talking about, again, someone's lack of economic power and how that impacts their treatment in the court system. We've taken on bail reform also. If you can imagine someone, and I mentioned this earlier today to a few people, who was being prosecuted for a crime and has a bail amount that's set that is so high that that person is going to have to remain incarcerated while they're waiting for their case to finally be heard. And then imagine that person who spent 2 or 3 years in pretrial detention solely because they cannot afford their bail, only to be found innocent once they have their day in court. That's 2 years of that person's life that has been lost. They've lost their job. They might have lost their home. They've lost their community ties. And in some instances, they've lost their family as well. And this, again, is because they could not afford to continue that activity while they waited out the conclusion of their case. We've also looked at it not just in the criminal context, but in the civil context, when you talk about people who are facing foreclosure. And because they can't hire an attorney, and because they on themselves as a layperson can't really navigate all of the legal intricacies of our court system, end up losing something as important and precious as their home. You think about it in the context of discrimination cases, of women like Ms. Ledbetter, who knew or found out for years that she was being paid a lot less than her male counterparts for doing the same job, and in some instances doing it better than her male counterparts. And when she finally is able to have her day in court and prove this fact, she nevertheless didn't receive any financial compensation for the damages that she had to suffer from. That is an access to justice issue, because if you avail yourself of the court system and yet you can't really achieve the remedy that you're entitled to, then what is the purpose of that system in the first place? Which leads me to another consequence of judicial vacancies and the lack of resources in the criminal justice or in the civil justice system, is a lack of confidence that our communities today have when it comes to judges, when it comes to court administration, and even when it comes to individuals like me who are lawyers, trying to do the best that we can, but because of all of the restraints, are not always able to work to our optimum. And so we believe that we have to continue to not only fill judicial vacancies, but make sure that we're filling those vacancies with people who really care about the law, who are in it for the right reasons, who represent all of the cross sections of our society. This is not just about getting more women elected to or appointed to the bench, or minorities appointed or elected to the bench. Those are important goals that we should continue to strive for. But it's also about making sure that judges understand that maybe sometimes a cop did plant that evidence, or maybe that person really did have their hand on the steering wheel when they were suspected of reaching for a weapon. That maybe when a person like Freddie Gray in Baltimore is alive when he gets into a police van, but when he arrives at the station is dead, and there's not a lot of explanation for that, maybe it means that we need to put a little bit more resources into our system so that people feel confident about it. We have a whole series, in fact, it's just not today and yesterday of police shootings. And whether they were justified or not, you have a situation where our society does not trust the judicial system, does not trust law enforcement. And a lot of that is because they don't see their grievances being adequately addressed in these systems. And so what do you turn to sometimes when you're frustrated and you lack other means of exercising your power? Violence, riots. That is why access to justice, our court system, our penal system, that is what is supposed to provide an alternative to people taking matters into their own hands and creating an uncivil society when we're supposed to be moving towards a civil society. So these are the issues, these are the types of cases that we at the ACLU work on. These are the matters that we see every day when we talk about access to justice and what does filling in judicial vacancies mean. These are the practical consequences for the communities and the individuals we represent and on the issues that we care about. So my hope is that the information you all received today and hopefully some of the motivation to remain active on this issue will translate into people having more confidence in our system, judges who really care again about the law and can at least have some understanding of what the litigants appearing before them might be experiencing, and that we can really also come up with some solutions that are not so dependent on judges, on the courts, on lawyers. I mean, the idea of walking across the country for climate change, that might be more powerful than a court case that will take years to be litigated, and then, you know, who knows if the companies and powers that be will ever have their due day in court. But that kind of civic grassroots activism is what we need to further develop and not place all of our eggs in the court basket. We need to come up with some innovative solutions so that we can again achieve what I hope is a common understanding that all people are entitled to the basic rights announced in our Bill of Rights and our Constitution, and that we really all should be treated equally. Thank you.